Okay, we now come to the last of the four presentations in the What Is series. This is actually a What are community studies? Presenters Professor Graham Crowe from Southampton.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to try and keep to time. I've got quite a lot of slides here, so I may dash through them fairly quickly. They are, as with all the other What Is presentations, on the NCRM website. So if you wish to go back and check any of the references, for example, then they'll be there. This is just a quick outline of my presentation. So I'm going to say something about the community studies tradition of research, say a bit about definitions, something on methodological issues, look at some examples of research that I think capture the potential of community studies, say a little bit about the evolution of community studies, and then some conclusions. Obviously each of these is going to be quite brief, but I want to leave time for questions, because I think in these What Is sessions, the questions and discussion are equally valuable to the presentation, if not more so. Okay, so community studies is a long-established, recognised body of work. Martin was speaking earlier about the problems of definition, and I guess this is a quite diverse body of work. But one of the things that tends to characterise these studies is that they're studies of ordinary people's everyday lives, and we can identify a number of sort of classic examples of community studies, some of which you may well have heard of. One of the most famous is a book that came out over 50 years ago by Michael Young and Peter Wilmot, called Family and Kinship in East London, and it sold over 500,000 copies. Maybe not many by Geoffrey Archer's standards, but pretty good for an academic text. I won't tell you about my royalties numbers, but I've got a long way to go to get anywhere near that. And interestingly, I think in relation to another event at the festival on Thursday afternoon, we've got Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett talking about the spirit level, and one of the things that they have said about the success of that book is that they published with Penguin. The Family and Kinship in East London was republished with Penguin, and that certainly helped to reach a wide audience. And Penguin are pretty canny publishers, and they recognised that this was a study that would be of interest far beyond the academic market. This is something that would interest a whole range of other people too, lay readers as well as academic researchers and teachers. So community studies, I think, fall into that pattern. And the current president of the British Sociological Association, John Brewer, was interviewed recently about the influences on his thought, and he said when he was much earlier on in his life and thinking about his career, one of the studies that influenced him was a study called Coal is Our Life, which was a study of a mining community in Yorkshire in the 1950s, and it was that amongst other things drew him to sociology and to a particular form of sociological research. So community studies are influential, and I'll try and sort of say something about why that is, something about their appeal. Okay, if we look at the tradition of research, it can and is often traced back to a classic study by Robert and Helen Lind called Middletown, a study in contemporary American culture. Middletown was a pseudonym. It was chosen to convey that this was small town America, a fairly typical sort of place. And interestingly, it didn't take too long before the real identity of Middletown came out. So I'm not revealing any secrets to say that it's Muncie, Indiana, and in fact it's somewhere that's been restudied a great deal. In that original study that came out in the late 1920s, what they said was, well, if we want to capture the nature of life in this small town American community, we'll explore 6 dimensions. And those dimensions are these that I put on the slide: getting a living, making a home, training the young, using leisure, engaging in religious practices, and engaging in community practices. So they said if we want to kind of give a picture of what ordinary people's everyday lives are like, then we need to say something about work, about home life, about education, about leisure, about religion, and about what we might broadly call community practice. So what we might broadly call the voluntary sector or the community sector or the third sector. They themselves, Robert and Helen Lind, conducted a restudy called Middletown in Transition, a study in cultural conflicts. And I want to come back to this point about restudies towards the end, because the initial book and the subsequent book that came out 8 years later are quite different in tone. And in the restudy, one of the things that the Linds give much more attention to is the importance of conflict and the importance of class divisions. Middletown, Muncie, is a town that was dominated by a particularly important local family, but that didn't really figure in the original study. But by the study that came out towards the end of the 1930s, there was much more emphasis on the power of this local family. So I think that set a trend towards people saying, well, actually restudies are quite useful as a way of capturing change, but also maybe as a way of sort of reflecting further on what we know about a particular phenomenon that we're studying, in this context, relationships. There are any number of overviews of the tradition of community studies research. These are just some of them. I have included one of my own on there, which I wrote with Graham Allen, which one reviewer said, because we tried to cover as many studies as possible in that particular book and say something about them. And this reviewer said that this book was exhaustive and only occasionally exhausting, which I think was, one of the nicest reviews I've had. So thank you to that reviewer. And I put a couple of 2010 references there, because I want to say that this is not just an historical account of a tradition that sort of rose and fell, but actually it's an evolving tradition which is still subject of a great deal of interest and activity and comment. So I put Tony Blackshaw's key concepts in community studies there, because all the work that he describes about community development and community action. And also Mike Savage. Some of you may have been at Mike Savage's Meet the Author session last night, and he has a chapter in his new book on identities and social change of Britain since 1940, which is about the British research in the Middletown tradition and why that failed. And those of you who went to that session will know that that's an important part of his overall argument about how research methods in the UK developed in that second half of the 20th century. Definitions. Martin said definitions are very tricky. Community is probably one of the most tricky terms to define. And I'm going to first quote Peter Wilmot, who says that the popularity of the word, and it's certainly a word that we hear a great deal. So, if a community study is a study of a community, well, what is a community? And Peter Wilmot says that, community is a word we hear all the time. We hear it referred to in everyday language. It's an important way of trying to capture ordinary people's everyday lives. But what does it mean? The more it's used, the less clear it seems to become. So the popularity of the word has not made its meaning any clearer. I rather like that quote. But it's getting at, the notion of community is getting at people having something in common. Takes us a certain way, but we then can ask, well, what is that thing? Peter Wilmot elsewhere talked about that may be shared territory. It may be people having a sort of place that holds them together, or a shared interest, a shared set of material interests, or it may be some sort of attachment, or it may be some combination of these. And in a lot of the classical sociological and social science writing on community studies, mining communities, coal mining communities, I mentioned Coal is Our Life, that's an example that's often held up as an ideal type of a community, because it's people who are bounded together by shared attachment to territory, shared attachment to interest. These are often very strongly single class communities. Some mining communities were over 90% made up of households who had some direct connection to the mining industry in the 1950s period, for example, and also some sense of attachment, common identity. There's a very strong sense of mining communities. So in those community studies, what they're doing is capturing the way in which people can be held together by a range of different things that they hold in common: shared place, shared interest, and shared identity. But it's difficult to define community. It's also got a further problem associated with the word community, because it's almost always used in a positive sense. Raymond Williams once said that that the word community is never used negatively. I don't think that's quite true, but in general, the word community, when it's attached to something, is used to imply that this is self-evidently a good thing. Who here is not in favour of community? I don't think anyone's going to put their hands up to that, are they? It would be a brave soul who did. Okay. And Raymond Plant, this is a quote from him and his colleagues going back to 1980. I put it in partly because Raymond Plant was the former master of this college here at St Catherine's, and he said community is a valued and valuable achievement. So that is, I think, all I'm going to say for the moment about the definitional challenges, but that on that basis we can then say that, well, community studies are research projects that are seeking to capture something about ordinary people's everyday lives in the round and how they all fit together, because one of the notions that's there in community studies is showing how the different bits fit together. Now, as critical social scientists, people doing community studies don't necessarily have to go along with preconceived notions about what community is. They don't have to go along with romanticised notions. And indeed, some of the classic studies, such as John Rex and Robert Moore's Race, Community and Conflict, which was a key study in the 1960s about Sparkbrook in Birmingham, was very much about how this area of Birmingham was made up of rivalry between a number of different groups who happened to live in that particular place. In particular, they were concerned with showing how conflict over housing was the basis of division between people who lived in Sparkbrook. Just because you lived in Sparkbrook didn't mean that you were part of one big happy family. Ken Dempsey's Australian study of a place he called Smalltown, which he anonymised because he wanted to wanted to try to capture that point about the meaning of community, said that the local rhetoric was that community is one big happy family, but he found, of course, that there were groups of people who were very clearly on the outside. And it shouldn't be assumed that community is necessarily greater than the sum of its individual parts. Sometimes where you've got conflict, communities are less than the sum of their individual parts. Methodological issues in community studies. So what I want to flag up here is that if we're studying all these things, so like in the Middletown study, economy, domestic life, education and training, leisure, religion, politics, how they all fit together, that's a methodological challenge in a number of respects. First of all, it's a big undertaking. Janet Foster, in her book on London Docklands, that book took over 10 years to write, and Suzanne Keller has written a book about American community, which took her on and off over 30 years. So this isn't something that's easily done within a short space of time. If you want to look at things in the round, it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of legwork. Second challenge is captured in this quote from Ronald Frankenberg, who's one of the key figures in the development of community studies. He was doing some research in a North Wales village, and he's just got this wonderful kind of account where he says, in my early days in the village, I would often climb a hill and look sadly down upon the rows of houses on the housing estate and wonder what went on inside them. He was an outsider, and why would people reveal things to him about their private lives? So community researchers are outsiders. They need to gain some access. And the challenge, even when you can gain access, you may gain access to some groups of people more than others. Jeff Payne, in a lovely article, chapter in a book, has asked, why are community studies so full of nice people? And the answer is, because you can read things like Young and Wilmot and think, gosh, those were the days, that was great. Wasn't it? Everyone's so friendly and so supportive, and if only I could have been doing research in those days, then that would have been the life. It may be that information is more readily available from some people than others, and we had a question earlier about how there may be a gender dimension to this in social research in general. Women are more responsive to social researchers, more positively disposed to say yes to interviews and so on than men are. There's a further reason why, even when you've gained access, there are challenges, because if you find things that you want to describe that are going to upset local people, then you as a researcher are putting yourself in quite a vulnerable position. And there are classic examples in the tradition of community studies of researchers who have been criticised or vilified, and in one case burned in effigy by the local people when they published their findings, because the local people thought that they'd given a rather unflattering description of the community. So it's not an easy process necessarily. And some people have criticised community studies as really not particularly breaking the boundaries, being based on analytical frameworks that are not challenging. And C. Wright Mills has this quote here about community studies being like badly written novels. He didn't mince his words. And some people say, well, do we need any more community studies? Just because this particular place or this particular group of people haven't been studied doesn't mean to say that there's any value in studying them. Maybe enough already is the answer. So for a period, community studies went out of fashion. And what I want to do is to just say something about some of the reasons why I think community studies coming back into fashion and being an ongoing tradition are a worthwhile part of social science research. Alwyn Rees, in his now over 50 years old study about a North Wales village, uses the local expression of the connections between people and their kinship connections as being woven together like a pig's entrails. And he makes the point that if you're doing field work, you need to be very careful what you say to people about other people in the area, because the chances are in a place like that they'll be related to each other. And he provides a lovely diagram, which I shall show you, of an early social network analysis, rather unsophisticated, but it ties in with what John was saying about social network analysis. So this is the social network representation of a pig house. Okay, this is the parish in North Wales, and these are the points of connection between people on the basis of kinship. So these are the sort of small farms and small settlements, and a line represents a kinship connection. So if you kind of look sideways and squint a bit, then that's any of you know what pig's entrails look like, actually? Just like that. Okay, very good. So that's one example. A second example is one that I've been doing some work on with other colleagues going back to. Ray Parl's divisions of labour, based on extensive work looking at the question of work in its broadest sense and what work means in an everyday sense. And in the book, Divisions of Labour, he describes his methods as ethnography, historical demography, and quantitative survey analysis. Actually, that is just the sort of shorthand version, because there's also historical documentary research, survey data. There was a 1 in 9 survey of the inhabitants of the households of the Isle of Sheppey in Kent. Research with employers, interviews, oral histories, ethnographic observations, and visual methods. And it's a fascinating study. It took an awful lot of time, and it took a great number of people. There were probably something like a dozen people involved in the research team at various times in Sheppey in Parl's overall project. But it has produced us with a very interesting and much referred to study at the time about the nature of social change, about the nature of work in all its sense, including informal work, economy, and so on. And just as an example of visual methods, this is a picture of some young lads in the early 1980s, ordinary people's everyday lives. So this is very typical Sheppey scene. And I just like that photograph as an example of what visual methods can bring to community studies. A third exemplar is by Karen OReilly, and Sarah was talking earlier about Karen's book on ethnography. She's also done an interesting set of projects really on British people who migrate to the Costa del Sol in Spain, and it's a fascinating example of how community studies agenda shifts with social change. There's now a substantial British expatriate community in Spain, people who move from the UK to live in Spain, and using a variety of methods to try to capture the nature of that community and to look at it through the framework of writing about ethnicity and community and identity. And she's able to make observations about what British people who've moved to the Costa del Sol say about insiders and outsiders. I mean, they do say some quite strange things, like, we don't have much contact with local people, but then we don't speak Spanish. So, I never quite get my head around that one, but I guess, it seemed fairly obvious to me that if you move to another country and don't learn the language, then your contact with local people is going to be fairly limited. But anyway, it's important there. She's also, interestingly, continued that piece of research, so she's got material about change over time as well. And community and time is an interesting issue. John was saying about social network analysis that it has been rather static, and I think that's probably true of a lot of community research as well. So capturing the fluid and changing nature of community relationships development in studies like Karen's. The fourth exemplar I want to talk about just briefly is Eric Lassiter and his colleagues, who've gone back to Middletown, back to Muncie, Indiana, and they've called their book The Other Side of Middletown, because what they pointed out is that in all the original studies and re-studies of Muncie by the Linds and by other people, you wouldn't know that there was a small but significant African American part of that community. And so they've called their book The Other Side of Middletown because they say that the earlier research had neglected this group, and that had important implications for thinking about Middle America, typical small town America, because it appeared that there was no African American part there. And the researchers changed focus, I think, is an important one, because re-studies are not simply replications. Researchers, as Martin was saying, researchers do bring their own agendas to research, and it's an important issue about what we research being something that we're sort of sensitive to. Eric Lassiter and his colleagues are using a method of participatory ethnography as well, and I think that's an important, interesting evolution, working with local people and not being the sort of researcher expert outsiders that come in and then just take material away from a community, but actually working with people, and in his case using students as an important part of the data generating process. And visual methods again. And I just wanted to show you this picture of the cover of the book, because I think this picture at the bottom is absolutely fantastic. I think we should have a sort of caption. What is this young girl on the left saying to her friend that's leading to that expression? I don't know how clearly you can see that, but that's got to be one of my favourite book covers, simply for the value of that photograph. Unfortunately, I've cut off in scanning this in. I've cut off all the co-editors of the study, so apologies to them. But if you look for Eric Lassiter, then you can get the full set there. So just go on to the evolution of community studies. So I'm suggesting that this isn't a static tradition, it's one that's evolving. And as I say, re-studies are not replications, but they do offer insights into sort of trying to capture social change. Just some examples of recent studies that have come out. So Nikki Charles and her colleagues going back to Swansea and re-studying a community or a set of communities that were studied originally in the 1960s. In Melbourne, in Australia, Lois Bryson and Ian Winter went back to a community there and looked at social change in the intervening period. And then Family and Kinship in East London has been restudied, and some of you may know this particularly controversial book by Jeff Dench and his colleagues. The et al. Includes Michael Young, who was one of the authors of the study, but unfortunately died before the final publication. But the New East End has had a great deal of controversy around it because of what it says about how that area of East London has changed in relation to race and ethnicity and diversity in the 50 years since Family and Kinship in East London came out. Restudies may be by the same people, they may be by different people, or they may, as in the case of Nikki Charles and Jeff Dench's teams, involve some of the original researchers as well as some new people as well. So conclusions finally, and then I'll stop. So community studies are a distinctive tradition of research, I'm suggesting. They're not a static approach. There's an evolving methodology there. There's an evolving theory as well. So, for example, as I say, Karen O'Reilly bringing in theories about identity and community and insiders and outsiders. And for me, community studies are exciting because they touch on a whole wider range of methodological issues about interdisciplinarity. John mentioned how the original network analysis was linked into anthropological studies, and that's certainly true. Anthropology has been important in the community studies tradition. There are issues around archiving. I can say a bit more, and I'm going to say a bit more tomorrow in another session about the reuse of the archive material from Ray Powell's study. This question about generalization, these big philosophical questions. So how many case studies do you need? Can you kind of scale up from having one or two community studies? You may have an interesting study of a particular place, but what can you say about the world more generally on the basis of that? The relationship between researchers and the people being researched. So there's the issue there about co-production of knowledge. and the issue of researchers being outsiders and so on, and also the purpose of research as well, because I go back to Ronald Frankenberg sitting on the hillside looking down on the villages saying, I wonder what's going on inside those people's houses. Maybe those people were looking out of their windows up at him and saying, I wonder what he's doing. Let's close the curtains. We don't want researchers coming in here. This is private. He can study street life if he wants to, but inside the house, that's none of his business. So I think community, trying to capture ordinary people's everyday lives, links into these wider research questions as well. And that's why I'm fairly confident that the tradition will carry on into the future. Okay.